Picture yourself out there in the middle of oceanic nowhere, surrounded only by black water and a silence that's downright terrifying. You think no one can see you. You figure whatever happens in that place will stay locked away forever between you and the waves. A secret shared with the sea. But while Brian Hooker was selling the world a story about a tragic accident and his 9-hour fight to stay alive, something was watching him. From 1,200 miles, up a commercial satellite part of a global tracking network that never ever sleeps, was logging every damn move the yacht Soulmate made. It wasn't just a witness. It was a digital ghost whose existence Brian knew absolutely nothing about. And what that satellite captured. Every turn, every shift in speed, every second of that endless night doesn't just cast doubt on Brian's story. It tears it apart. It destroys it completely. I spent hours digging deep into the technical framework of this tracking system and those leaked maps Brian himself sent to his friends. And honestly, what the data shows versus what Brian swore happened, well, that's where the true face of his story starts to show. We're not talking about some small mistake. It's a massive, chilling contradiction that changes everything we thought we knew about Lynette's final minutes. Before we dive headfirst into the computers and phones the FBI just seized, or that bizarre moment when Brian fell overboard in handcuffs. Right, as police were boarding his boat, we need to talk about the data, about information that can't be erased and that nobody can fabricate. Because the ocean may be silent, but satellites aren't. And finally, they're starting to speak. Here's the thing you have to understand about the sea. In 2026, it's no longer that wild, untrackable frontier it used to be. Brian Hooker assured Bahamian police that the night of April 4th, he was simply a victim of circumstance. He said the dinghy's motor died, that the wind separated him from his wife, and that he spent 9 agonizing hours rowing, alone, in the middle of the darkness trying to reach solid ground. It's a survival story that sounds heroic on paper, but there's a huge digital problem. A massive technical detail Brian apparently forgot about. It's called AIS, the Automatic Identification System. Think of it as a trail of digital breadcrumbs every large vessel leaves in its wake. Every few seconds, the yacht Soulmate was broadcasting a signal. It was transmitting its exact location, how fast it was going, and even its heading to anyone with a receiver. We're talking coastal stations, other nearby boats, and an entire network of satellites orbiting the Earth. Watching. This isn't like a cell phone signal that drops or a GPS you can just switch off. It's not that easy. It's a constant transmission burned into the system. And this is where his story starts falling apart in a pretty disturbing way. Carly, Lynette's daughter, has been working with investigators and brought something to light that should give anyone goosebumps. According to her, the AIS data from that night proves that the Soulmate, the big yacht where Brian supposedly was moving during the exact same time frame when he swore he was adrift helpless in a tiny rubber dinghy. Think about that for a second. If Brian is in a dinghy miles away, fighting for his life, then who the hell was moving the yacht? A boat that size doesn't just go for a stroll on its own. You need someone in command, someone at the helm. Someone has to fire up the engines and navigate. If the data says the boat was moving, then Brian's entire timeline, that whole lost at sea story, isn't just a mistake. It's a cold, calculated lie. But it gets worse. See, AIS data is archived on servers run by independent companies all over the world. There's no way to control it. Brian can't just call up and ask them to erase a couple of hours. He can't say the file got corrupted. It doesn't work that way. It's archived in multiple places at once. It's the kind of evidence lawyers call a silent witness. And as one legal expert put it, this kind of information is absolutely terrifying for his defense. Why? Let me explain. Because you can't argue with a satellite. You can't tell a jury the satellite was jealous of him or got the time wrong. What's truly spine-chilling is the level of detail in this record. It's not just a little dot moving on a map. We're talking about a second-by-second breakdown. We know when the boat started up, how fast it was going, and exactly where it stopped. If Brian used that yacht to dispose of evidence or to reposition before miraculously showing up at Marsh Harbor, every move was recorded. Every turn is burned into a server somewhere in the cloud. The investigation isn't just hunting for scattered facts anymore. Now they're crunching the math. They're comparing the speed of a man rowing against the digital pulses of a high-powered yacht. And those two stories aren't just different. They're from opposite worlds. Brian said he was a man at the mercy of the sea. But the satellites may prove he was in complete control. navigating in the shadows while the world thought he was gasping for breath. But as much of a gut punch as the satellite data is, it wasn't the only thing that caught investigators' attention. Because while that digital ghost of the Soulmate was telling one version, agents were finding another piece of the puzzle, a very different one. Because while the boat's digital trail told one story, the truth was finally starting to come to light. Brian's body language was already starting to tell a very different story, and it all exploded in a moment of pure chaos on the deck of that same boat. An episode where a pair of handcuffs and a sudden plunge left everyone wondering whether Brian was a real victim or just an actor way too committed to his role. Satellite data is cold mechanical, devoid of emotion. But what happened on April 8th was pure drama unfiltered. That day, the investigation stopped being a search for a missing person and turned into something much darker and more suffocating. Police didn't return to the Soulmate just to ask routine questions. They showed up with a court warrant in hand to take every trace of the digital life Brian kept on that yacht. We're talking laptops, tablets, and every one of his cell phones. And what went down during that operation is honestly one of the strangest scenes I've ever witnessed in a criminal case. Picture the scene. Brian Hooker is back on his yacht, the same place where he swore he'd spent years of absolute bliss with Lynette. Only this time, his hands are in handcuffs. Bahamian agents are everywhere bagging evidence, while the sea around them is turning rougher and more treacherous by the minute. And suddenly, in the blink of an eye, Brian, a man who supposedly just survived 9 hours of rowing in the middle of a storm, loses his balance and falls overboard. He goes into the water still in handcuffs, forcing officers to scramble desperately to get him out before it was too late. His lawyer later argued that conditions were dangerous and that Brian ended up with a pretty nasty knee injury from the fall. But when you stop and look at the human factor, there's something that just doesn't add up. We're talking about a man who just 4 days earlier claimed to have the physical endurance of an elite athlete. He said he rowed in a tiny rubber dinghy for miles, through a dark, choppy, violent sea. If he had the strength and balance to come out of that alive, how is it that he slipped so easily on the deck of his own yacht right when police start examining his hard drives? It's a huge contradiction that investigators, of course, didn't let slide. Either the sea wasn't as rough the night Lynette disappeared, or Brian isn't as physically capable as he wants us to believe. You can't have it both ways. You can't be a heroic castaway one day and a frail victim who can't stand up the next. It looked less like an accident, and more like a distraction tactic. Maybe it was the physical collapse of a man who couldn't handle the pressure anymore. That supposed knee injury became his ticket out of direct interrogation. They took him to the hospital, treated him, and that gave him breathing room. But time was the one thing Brian no longer had on his side. Because while he was in a hospital bed or a jail cell, the digital forensics team was already cracking open those computers. People tend to forget that your phone and your computer are at the end of the day the black boxes of the human soul. Think about your search history or the private messages you send when you think no one's watching. Now imagine you're in the middle of a high-profile investigation. Police were hunting for every last detail. Did he search how to disable the automatic identification system? Did he look up tide patterns in the Abaco Islands before the trip? Did he text someone in Sacramento saying he'd be home sooner than expected? The fact that a court warrant was even issued tells us a judge saw enough reason to believe that inside those circuits was evidence of a crime. You don't get a warrant to seize somebody's digital life just because his wife is missing. You get it because there's a gap in the story that only data can fill. And while Brian was faking pain in his knee in the water, the FBI was quietly stepping onto the scene, ready to haul those devices off to a lab where no accidental fall could stop the truth. It all leaves you thinking. Did he really lose his balance, or was he losing control of his own lie? Because as we'll see now, the maps Brian was showing his friends didn't exactly line up with the reality of the ocean. He was trying to paint a portrait of a hero, but the paint was starting to run. While satellites watched from space, and police fought to get Brian back on the boat, other evidence was circulating under the radar, and this came straight from Brian's own hands. See, after the incident, Brian wasn't just talking to agents. He was texting his friends trying to explain the unexplainable. In those chats, he sent something he probably thought would save him screenshots of Navionics maps. If you're not into boating, Navionics is basically the gold standard in marine navigation. It's an app that shows you depth currents and the exact route your vessel has taken. Brian sent these marked-up maps to his inner circle with a red line tracing his supposed route from the Soulmate to Marsh Harbor. He was practically telling them, "Look, here's the proof of my struggle. This is exactly where I rode for 9 hours." When forensic experts and veteran Bahamian sailors analyzed those maps, the red flags didn't just appear. They burned with unbearable intensity. The map Brian presented showed him moving along a suspiciously logical trajectory, almost a surgical line towards safety. But the ocean doesn't do geometry. The sea never draws straight lines, and certainly not in the pitch dark of the Sea of Abaco. The night Lynette vanished, the tides were right in the middle of a cycle change. The currents in that specific area are notoriously treacherous and impossible to predict. If you're stuck in a tiny rubber dinghy, barely 8 feet long with nothing but a cheap plastic oar, you're completely at the mercy of the water's will. It's pure physics. If the current is dragging you hard to the south while you're trying to go west, moving in a straight line is an absolute fantasy. You're going to drift. You're going to have to fight tooth and nail for every damn inch you gain. And yet Brian's evidence looked like the calculated route of a commuter train. It felt like a path designed by someone who already had the ending to his story figured out. It didn't have the trail of someone fighting for his life in absolute panic. And this is where things get really murky. The times recorded on those maps just don't match human endurance. To have covered the distance, Brian swore he did. In the time he claimed it took, he would have had to row at a speed that's physically impossible for a man his age. Under that level of physical and emotional stress, it's like saying you ran a marathon in record time wearing heavy combat boots. Insane. And carrying a backpack on top of it. Honestly, the story doesn't pass the most basic logic test. It stinks. Local captains, who've been navigating those waters for 40 years, looked at his coordinates and just shook their heads. They knew something was off. They understand that if he really had been adrift at that exact spot, the current would have pushed him helplessly toward the shallow reefs. Or maybe toward the open sea, but it never would have dropped him perfectly at the entrance to the shipyard in Marsh Harbor. Not with that precision. It looks like Brian calmly sat down with his iPad and designed a route that would make him look like a hero, like the perfect survivor. But he forgot that the ocean keeps its own records, ones you can't erase with a digital pencil. That's the big danger of trying to be too perfect. Lies tend to be neat. A real survivor's story is chaotic, full of gaps and phrases like, "I don't know how I got here," or "I lost track of time." Brian's, on the other hand, was too clinical. Every screenshot and every explanation felt polished, as if they'd been sterilized for a jury. That's when investigators asked themselves the key question. Why would a man who just lost his wife be so obsessed with validating his GPS coordinates? Usually, in the middle of grief, you don't worry about navionics settings. You worry about the person who's no longer standing next to you. The emptiness. But Brian only saw the map. He was focused on the line. On making sure everyone bought his version of the where and the how. He was doing it because he knew that if anyone looked too closely at the why, his whole setup would come crashing down like a house of cards. And while he was busy defending his maps, a new voice burst onto the scene with devastating force. Lynette's daughter, Carly. She wasn't analyzing GPS signals or tide charts. Carly was staring straight at the man her mother had married. She was ready to reveal to the world that dark side of Brian Hooker that no satellite or digital map could ever detect. Look, up to this point, we've been focused on the cold data on the satellites and the intermittent GPS signals. But data only tells you what happened. It doesn't tell you who these people were when the cameras turned off and they were left alone. That's where the darkness gets really thick. Carly finally broke the silence, and what she said changed the course of everything. She didn't just describe the night of the disappearance. She talked about the months before, the slow, painful erosion of their relationship. According to her testimony, that image of the perfect couple we all saw on social media was a total sham. A well-rehearsed lie. Carly dropped an information bomb that completely reshaped the motive in this case. It was a devastating psychological twist. She revealed that for years, Brian and Lynette had led a life of absolute sobriety. It was an ironclad pact they'd made together. But when they got to Key West, right before setting sail for the Bahamas, something changed. That pact was broken. Sobriety came to an end. And with the return of alcohol, the old demons woke up. Carly described a marriage that was starting to crack under constant pressure. They were sinking under the weight of genuinely cruel arguments. And we're not talking about simple domestic spats over dinner. They were deep structural fractures. She suggested that Brian simply couldn't stand Lynette's strength or her own inner light. On that boat, isolated in the middle of the vast ocean, there was no one to act as a buffer between them. They were alone. No one to call for help. Just two people, a mountain of history. and the explosive return to a lifestyle that had already destroyed them before. Now think about the testimony from the bartender at the Abaco Inn. He remembered perfectly that they were drinking Cuba Libre's rum with Coke. To anyone else, it's just a couple enjoying a drink on vacation. But with what Carly revealed, those drinks were a deafening danger signal. If they were supposed to be sober, and they'd started drinking again, the tension on that yacht must have been unbearable. Almost electric. Alcohol doesn't just alter behavior, it annihilates judgment. It turns small sparks into wildfires you can't control. And this is exactly where the why of this whole tragedy starts to take on a deeply terrifying meaning. If things were falling apart behind closed doors, if resentment was growing day after day while they were trapped on that boat, then that accidental fall into the water starts to look a whole lot more like a final solution to a problem Brian didn't know how to fix. Carly's account suggests that Brian's calm after Lynette's disappearance wasn't the product of shock. It was the behavior of a man who at last felt relieved. And that casts his actions the following day in a very different light. Normally in the face of tragedy, you lean on family. You call your kids. You stay out searching until your hands bleed. But Brian did none of that. His mind was on the boat. He was obsessed with catching his flight back to Sacramento. It seemed like he was trying to flee the ghost of his marriage before the authorities started asking what really happened in the weeks before April 4th. Carly isn't just a grieving daughter. She's a first-hand witness to the raw reality of that shared life. She knows how Brian's temper would explode. She knows what he was capable of when the masks finally came off. And her testimony is the reason the FBI didn't give up when Bahamian police let Brian go without charges. They realized this wasn't a simple maritime accident, but the climax of a much longer and more violent story. While the satellites told us where the boat was, Carly showed us what was going through Brian's head. When you put both pieces together, the picture that emerges is frankly terrifying. It's the story of a man who believed the vastness of the ocean would bury his secrets, never suspecting that the ones he left behind knew exactly where to look. But there's one last piece missing in this puzzle. Because while Carly was talking, the FBI wasn't wasting any time. They weren't just hunting for evidence of drinking or arguments. They were tracking the one thing Brian thought he'd put out of reach: his digital footprint. What they found on those seized devices is what ultimately brings closure to this whole story. We've already looked at the satellites, the strange behavior on the boat, and the reality of his marriage. But here's the detail that should really be keeping him up at night. Brian Hooker walked free. He left that Bahamian jail, got on a plane, and went back to Sacramento. To the rest of the world, it looked like he'd gotten away with it. People were furious. They were talking about a total failure of justice. But what Brian didn't understand is that being released doesn't mean being innocent. Bahamian police used a very specific phrase, pending further investigation. That's not just legal jargon, it's a warning. In the world of high-level forensics, the clock doesn't stop because a suspect is on a plane. In fact, that's when the heavy lifting starts. While Brian was trying to pick up his life in California, the FBI and the United States Coast Guard were performing a digital autopsy on every device they pulled off the Soulmate. And this is where the United States' special maritime jurisdiction comes into play. Since Lynette is an American citizen, and this happened on a U.S.-registered vessel, the FBI can file federal charges regardless of what happens in the Bahamas. They're not just looking for a smoking gun. They're after the digital video recorder data and the search history Brian thought was private. Think about it. If you're planning something or trying to cover it up, you're going to look up information about it. You're going to search how to reset the AIS, how long a body floats, or what legal jurisdiction applies in international waters. You can delete the history, but the FBI doesn't care what you deleted. They care what's left in the metadata. They're interested in those file fragments that prove you were already thinking about this days, weeks, or months before setting sail. And then there are the phones. Every time your cell connects to a network or pings a GPS signal, it creates a record. If Brian's phone registers activity at 2 in the morning while he was supposedly rowing for his life in a dinghy, it's over. If there are messages sent to Sacramento that contradict what he told police in Marsh Harbor, he's done. The FBI is famous for its patience. They don't rush to charge anyone just to grab headlines. They wait until they have a mountain of evidence so high that no defense attorney in the world can scale it. The most chilling part is that Brian is living right now in that tense calm before the storm. Justice is in the details. He's at home maybe thinking the worst is already over. But every day, a forensic analyst in a lab is going through thousands of lines of data, connecting satellite signals to the records from his own phone. They're building a timeline so precise, It will account for every second of that night. The investigation is still active. It's still moving. And that language about pending results suggests they're just waiting for one last forensic report. Maybe an autopsy or a recovered file to finally pull the trigger. Brian Hooker may have left those islands behind, but he couldn't run from his own digital trail. In 2026, data is that ice-cold witness that never blinks and never forgets. We've now laid out the satellite trap, the physical drama, the rigged maps, and the sinister reality of his marriage. Now the FBI has the floor, because when they finally act, the maybes and the allegedlys will cease to exist. The science and the evidence are in full agreement. It's the final verdict on what happened to Lynette Hooker.